Questions 1 to 6. You will hear a man giving a talk about the 1977 New York City blackout. Complete the notes below. Write no more than 2 words and/or a number for each answer.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about one of the most remarkable events in New York City's history, the blackout of 1977. Although the loss of electricity lasted for only a little over a day, it affected millions of people and remains one of the city's best-known emergencies. Engineers still study the event because it revealed how vulnerable a large city can become when an essential service suddenly fails. Before looking at what happened on the streets, it's worth understanding how the blackout actually began. During the evening of July 13, a series of severe thunderstorms moved across the area north of New York City. At 9:34 p.m., several lightning strikes damaged important equipment connected to the electrical network. Normally, if one transmission line fails, electricity can be redirected through other parts of the system. Unfortunately, several protective devices did not work as intended that evening. As more equipment shut down, the remaining transmission lines became overloaded, and within a short time, almost the entire city had lost power. For most residents, the change was immediate. Homes, offices, restaurants, and shops suddenly became dark. Thousands of passengers found themselves waiting inside subway stations because trains could no longer continue their journeys. At the same time, hundreds of elevators stopped between floors. Firefighters spent hours rescuing people trapped inside elevators. Although very few people were seriously injured, these rescue operations kept emergency crews extremely busy throughout the night. The power failure also created serious transportation problems. Without working traffic lights, many of the city's busiest intersections quickly became congested. Instead of investigating accidents or responding to routine calls, many police officers were assigned to manage traffic by hand. Even with their help, delays spread across much of the city, and public transport services were unable to operate normally. Another major concern was keeping essential services running. Hospitals still had patients in operating rooms, emergency departments, and intensive care units, so losing electricity could have had serious consequences. Fortunately, most major hospitals immediately switched to backup generators, allowing doctors and nurses to continue treating patients safely. Radio stations also remained on the air whenever possible, broadcasting advice and information for residents as engineers worked to identify the source of the problem. Although many New Yorkers remained calm and hoped the power would soon return, city leaders understood that the situation might become more difficult as time passed. The technical failure was beginning to create wider social problems. If electricity could not be restored quickly, frustration might increase, emergency services would remain under pressure, and there was a growing risk of public disorder in some parts of the city. At that point, however, no one knew exactly how the rest of the night would unfold.
Questions 7 to 10. You will hear the rest of the talk about the 1977 New York City blackout. Choose the correct answer A, B, C, or D.
So, what happened after the first few hours? As midnight approached, it became clear that restoring electricity would take much longer than city officials had originally hoped. Engineers were still examining damaged equipment, and there was no reliable estimate of when power would return. This uncertainty made the situation increasingly difficult for both emergency services and the public. It's important to remember that not every part of New York experienced the blackout in the same way. In many residential neighborhoods, people remained calm. Families sat outside their apartment buildings to escape the warm indoor temperatures, neighbors chatted by candlelight, and some residents shared flashlights, food, or batteries with those who needed them. Volunteers even helped elderly people walk safely through dark streets or carried supplies to those who were unable to leave their homes. These small acts of kindness helped many communities remain peaceful throughout the night.
Questions 7 to 10. You will hear the rest of the talk about the 1977 New York City blackout. Choose the correct answer A, B, C, or D.
When newspapers and television stations reported the blackout, many of them focused mainly on the scenes of looting, because those images were the most dramatic. Historians, however, have since argued that this created an incomplete picture of what actually happened. Alongside the criminal activity, thousands of ordinary residents were helping neighbors, assisting stranded travelers, and supporting emergency workers. Those quieter stories received much less attention, even though they reflected the experience of many people across the city. The blackout also encouraged both utility companies and city officials to review their emergency procedures. Electrical equipment was upgraded, communication between different agencies was improved, and emergency response plans were rewritten. Although experts knew that no power system could ever be completely free from failure, they believed the city would be much better prepared if another major outage occurred. Looking back today, the 1977 blackout is remembered not simply because millions of people lost electricity. Rather, it demonstrated that the strength of a modern city depends on more than technology alone. Reliable infrastructure is essential, but the willingness of public services and local communities to cooperate can be just as important when an unexpected crisis occurs.
Questions 11 to 20. You will hear a man and a woman talking about the renovation of the man's house. For questions 11 to 16, choose 6 answers from the box, and write the correct letter A to G next to questions 11 to 16. Which change has been made to each part of the house?
Daniel, it's great to see you again. Last time we met, you were surrounded by paint cans and boxes. Please don't tell me you're still living on a building site.
Fortunately, no. The builders finally finished about 2 weeks ago. I honestly thought the whole project would take 3 months, but it ended up lasting nearly 5. Looking back, though, I think the extra time was worth it.
I remember you saying that you only wanted to update a few rooms. Somehow these projects always become much bigger than people expect.
That's exactly what happened. Every time we solved one problem, we discovered another. Once the builders removed a couple of walls, they found old pipes and electrical wiring that also needed attention. It wasn't what we'd planned, but it made sense to deal with everything while the house was already being renovated.
So, where did you start?
The kitchen. It used to be one of the smallest rooms in the house, and there was a wall separating it from the dining room. At first, we thought about simply replacing the cupboards, but after discussing it with the architect, we realized we'd enjoy the space much more if we removed the wall completely. Now it's one large open-plan room, and there's enough space for everyone to cook together without getting in each other's way.
I like open kitchens. They make the whole house feel brighter. Did that turn out to be the biggest job?
Definitely. It created the most dust as well. But once it was finished, everything else seemed much easier.
What about the living room? I remember it already looked quite comfortable.
We agreed there wasn't much wrong with it. We considered buying new furniture, but after comparing prices, we decided it wasn't necessary. Instead, we chose a much lighter colour for the walls and ceiling. It's surprising how different the room feels now. It looks much larger, even though we haven't changed its size at all.
That's often the smartest approach. Sometimes decorating makes a bigger difference than replacing everything. Exactly. We tried to spend money where it would really improve the house. I suppose you also replaced the windows. You used to complain that they let in cold air during the winter. That was the original plan. We even asked for quotations to install completely new windows. Then a specialist inspected them and said the wooden frames were still in excellent condition. He recommended repairing the damaged parts instead. It turned out to be much cheaper, and the windows now work perfectly.
That's good news. New windows can be incredibly expensive.
Tell me about it. Saving money there meant we could spend a little more elsewhere.
Such as?
The garage, actually. We realised we'd hardly used it for parking during the last few years because the driveway was more convenient. For a while, we discussed turning it into a guest bedroom, but eventually we decided a home gym would be far more useful. Now, everyone in the family uses it several times a week.
I wasn't expecting that. Have you become interested in fitness all of a sudden?
Maybe a little. Or perhaps I just feel guilty after spending so much time sitting behind a desk.
Fair enough. Did you change the staircase as well? I remember it looked rather old-fashioned.
We talked about replacing it with a modern design, but the builder advised us not to. He explained that it was built from excellent quality wood and was still extremely strong. Once we'd heard that, it seemed unnecessary to change it, so we left it exactly as it was.
That was probably the right decision. Original features often give a house more character.
That's what we thought too.
And finally, what happened to the garden?
It needed a complete rethink. The old path ran straight through the middle, making the seating area feel quite small. Rather than removing the path altogether, the landscape designer suggested relocating it closer to the fence. That gave us enough space to build a much larger patio, which has made the garden much more practical whenever friends or family come to visit.
It sounds as though every decision had been carefully thought through.
We certainly tried. The whole experience taught us that successful renovation isn't about changing everything. It's about making sensible improvements that suit the way you actually live.
Questions 17 to 20. You will hear the rest of the conversation between the man and the woman about the house renovation. Choose the correct answer A, B, or C.
Now that everything's finished, do you think the renovation turned out the way you imagined?
In some ways, yes, but in others, not at all. Before we started, I was mostly thinking about how the house would look. I spent hours choosing colours, comparing kitchen designs, and looking at furniture online. But after living in the renovated house for a couple of weeks, I've realised that appearance isn't actually the most important thing.
Really? That's not what I expected you to say.
Neither did I. What matters most is how much easier the house is to live in. For example, the open kitchen means we're no longer separated when someone's preparing dinner. The garage is used almost every day now, whereas before it was just full of old boxes that nobody wanted to throw away. Even small changes, like having better lighting in the hallway, make everyday life more comfortable.
I know exactly what you mean. We renovated our bathroom last year, and although it doesn't look dramatically different, it's much more practical.
Sometimes the improvements you notice every day are the ones that matter most.
Exactly. That's something I wish I'd understood from the beginning.
Was staying within your budget as difficult as people always say?
Even harder. We had calculated everything very carefully before the builders arrived, but then the prices of several materials increased unexpectedly. Timber became more expensive, and so did some of the electrical equipment we'd chosen. We didn't want to borrow extra money, so we had to rethink a few ideas instead.
Did you have to give up anything you really wanted?
Yes. We'd planned to install solar panels on the roof while the builders were already working there. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. Unfortunately, once we added up all the costs, we realised it simply wasn't realistic. Rather than rushing into another large expense, we decided to postpone that project until next year.
That seems sensible. It's probably better to finish one project properly than to leave everything half completed.
That's exactly how we looked at it.
What about the builders? I've heard so many stories about unreliable companies. We were actually quite lucky, but only because we spent a lot of time choosing the right one. At first, I was tempted to accept the cheapest quotation. It looked like an excellent deal. Then I compared it with 2 other companies and realised that several important jobs weren't included in the price. If we'd chosen that company, we'd probably have received lots of unexpected bills later. So the cheapest option wasn't really the cheapest after all? That's right. In the end, we chose a local company that had excellent reviews. They weren't the least expensive, but they explained every stage of the work, contacted us whenever they discovered a problem, and finished everything to a high standard. Looking back, I think that decision probably saved us a lot of stress.
Did you manage to do any of the work yourself?
Just the decorating in one bedroom and a few shelves in my study. I watched plenty of online videos and thought about trying some of the electrical work too, but then I realised that if I made a mistake, it could be dangerous as well as expensive. I decided that some jobs are simply better left to professionals.
I completely agree. There's a big difference between painting a wall and rewiring a house.
Absolutely. I also learned that renovations nearly always take longer than expected. Even when everyone works hard, unexpected problems appear. If I ever renovate another house, I'll allow much more extra time in the schedule, instead of expecting everything to go perfectly.
So, after everything you've been through, would you do it again?
Yes, without any doubt. It wasn't always enjoyable while it was happening, but now the house suits the way we actually live. Instead of trying to make it look like something in a magazine, we've created a home that's comfortable, practical, and much more enjoyable for the whole family. For me, that's been the biggest success of the entire project.
Questions 21 to 30. You will hear a woman talking about the history of the Eiffel Tower. For questions 21 to 26, complete the notes below. Write no more than 2 words and/or a number for each answer.
Good morning. Today I'd like to talk about one of the world's most famous landmarks, the Eiffel Tower. It is difficult to imagine Paris without it, but surprisingly, many people once believed it should never have been built. The story begins in the 1880s, when France was preparing for the 1889 World's Fair, an international exhibition celebrating the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. The organisers wanted an impressive structure that would demonstrate the country's engineering achievements. Gustav Eiffel and his team proposed an iron tower unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not everyone admired the idea. Before construction even started, a group of well-known writers, painters, and architects signed a public protest. They argued that the enormous iron structure would ruin the beauty of Paris and dominate the city's historic skyline. Newspapers published many of these complaints, and for a time the project faced considerable public criticism. Even after construction began, many Parisians remained doubtful that the tower would ever become attractive.
Despite these objections, work continued remarkably quickly. When the tower was completed in 1889, millions of visitors came to see the World's Fair. People from around the world were fascinated by its height and unusual design, making it one of the exhibition's greatest attractions. Although many local residents still disliked it, international visitors were often much more enthusiastic. However, there was one important detail that many people today do not realise. The Eiffel Tower was never intended to remain in Paris permanently. According to the original agreement, it was supposed to stand for only 20 years before being taken down. Once the exhibition had ended, many people expected it to disappear from the city's skyline. Fortunately, engineers soon discovered that the tower could be useful for far more than tourism. Because of its exceptional height, it became an excellent location for scientific experiments. Researchers used it to study weather conditions, wireless communication, and radio signals. As technology developed during the early 20th century, these experiments proved increasingly valuable.
The tower also became an important radio transmission point. Military leaders and government officials recognized that it could play a practical role in communication, especially during times of national emergency. As a result, the structure was no longer viewed simply as a temporary exhibition attraction. Instead, it had developed an entirely new purpose. Its scientific and military value eventually persuaded officials that demolishing the tower would be a mistake. Rather than removing it, they decided to keep it standing. That single decision completely changed the future of the structure. By the middle of the 20th century, attitudes had changed dramatically. The same tower that had once divided public opinion gradually became one of France's best-loved landmarks. Tourist numbers continued to increase year after year, and today millions of people visit it annually. What was once considered an ugly temporary structure is now recognized as one of the world's greatest architectural icons.
Questions 27 to 30. You will hear the rest of the talk about the Eiffel Tower. Choose the correct answer A, B, or C.
Although the Eiffel Tower had avoided demolition, its future was still uncertain in another way. Keeping such a large iron structure standing required continuous maintenance, and this was both expensive and time-consuming. Engineers soon realised that the iron needed regular inspections and fresh coats of paint to protect it from rust. Since then, the tower has been repainted many times, a process that takes well over a year to complete and requires hundreds of workers. As transportation became easier during the 20th century, international tourism grew rapidly. More visitors included Paris in their travel plans, and for many of them, climbing the Eiffel Tower became the highlight of their trip. Restaurants, observation decks, and improved visitor facilities encouraged tourists to spend more time there. Instead of being viewed simply as a remarkable piece of engineering,
the tower gradually became one of the city's most successful tourist attractions. The tower also developed a symbolic meaning that nobody had expected in the 19th century. Film directors often included it in opening scenes because audiences could immediately recognize the location. It appeared in travel advertisements, works of art, and even company logoed. Before long, people around the world no longer thought of the Eiffel Tower as a temporary exhibition structure. Instead, they associated it with Paris itself. In many ways, the image of the city and the image of the tower became impossible to separate.
Even today, modern technology continues to influence the tower's role. Television and radio antennas have been added over the years, and new lighting systems have made the structure an attraction, both during the day and at night. These changes have allowed the tower to remain useful while preserving its original appearance. Rather than turning it into a museum piece, engineers have found ways to adapt it to modern needs without changing its character. Perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is how dramatically public opinion changed. The artists and writers who protested against the tower believed they were protecting Paris from an ugly industrial structure. However, later generations saw something entirely different. They admired its bold design, its historical importance, and the opportunities it offered visitors to experience the city from above. Today, it is difficult to imagine Paris without it, and few people would argue that the city would be more beautiful if the tower disappeared. For historians, the Eiffel Tower offers an important lesson. New ideas are often judged according to current tastes and expectations, yet those opinions can change as society changes. Buildings that seem strange at first may eventually become symbols of national identity. The Eiffel Tower reminds us that the true value of an ambitious project is not always recognised immediately.
Questions 31 to 40. You will hear a food historian giving a talk about the history of chocolate. For questions 31 to 33, choose 3 letters A to F.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I'd like to take you on a journey through the fascinating history of chocolate. Although most of us think of chocolate as a sweet snack or dessert, its story began thousands of years ago, and it was very different from the chocolate we enjoy today. The earliest evidence of chocolate comes from Central America, where cacao trees grew naturally in tropical forests. Long before Europeans knew anything about chocolate, civilizations such as the Maya and later the Aztecs had already discovered that the seeds of the cacao fruit could be used to make a drink. They collected the beans, allowed them to ferment, dried them in the sun, roasted them, and finally ground them into a thick paste. This paste was mixed with water and various spices to create a rich drink. Unlike modern hot chocolate, it was usually bitter rather than sweet, because people did not add sugar. For these ancient civilizations, cacao was much more than an ordinary food. Historical records show that cacao beans were highly respected and even used as a form of money. People could exchange them for everyday goods in local markets, and wealthy families often stored large quantities of beans as a sign of their status. Chocolate drinks were also served during important ceremonies, celebrations, and religious events, making cacao both economically and culturally significant.
Everything began to change in the 16th century when Spanish explorers arrived in Central America. They encountered chocolate for the first time and brought both cacao beans and the recipe for the drink back to Europe. At first, many Europeans found the original taste rather unusual because it was much less sweet than the drinks they were accustomed to.
Gradually, however, they began adding sugar, cinnamon, and sometimes vanilla. These changes made chocolate much more popular among European nobility. For many years, chocolate remained an expensive luxury. Preparing it required considerable time and effort, and cacao had to be transported across the Atlantic Ocean. As a result, only wealthy people could afford to drink it regularly. Ordinary families rarely had the opportunity to taste chocolate at all. The situation changed dramatically during the 19th century. New machines made it possible to process cacao beans much more efficiently than before. Instead of grinding the beans entirely by hand, factories could produce chocolate on a much larger scale. Manufacturers also developed new techniques that improved both the texture and flavour of chocolate, making it smoother and more enjoyable to eat. These technological developments had another important effect. As production became faster and less expensive, the price of chocolate gradually fell. Shops began selling chocolate to a much wider range of customers, rather than only to the richest members of society. By the end of the 19th century, chocolate had become a product that many ordinary families could afford from time to time. Today, chocolate is enjoyed in almost every country in the world and is available in countless varieties. Yet behind every chocolate bar lies a long history involving ancient civilizations, international trade, scientific innovation, and changing tastes. Understanding that history helps us appreciate just how remarkable this everyday food really is.
Questions 34 to 40. You will hear the rest of a talk by a food historian about the history of chocolate. For questions 34 to 40, choose the correct answer A, B, or C.
So, how did chocolate become one of the world's favourite foods? The answer lies not only in improvements to production, but also in changing lifestyles. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people began moving from the countryside to growing industrial cities. Factory workers wanted affordable foods that were easy to carry and provided plenty of energy. Chocolate was ideal because it was small, convenient, and high in calories. Before long, companies were producing chocolate bars that people could buy almost anywhere. Competition between chocolate manufacturers also encouraged innovation. Instead of selling only plain chocolate, companies experimented with new recipes and ingredients. They added milk, nuts, dried fruit, and different flavourings to attract more customers. Attractive packaging and newspaper advertisements helped create well-known brands that people still recognise today. Buying chocolate was no longer simply about satisfying hunger. It also became associated with enjoyment, celebrations, and giving gifts. As demand increased, cacao farming expanded into other tropical regions, particularly parts of Africa and Asia. Today, countries such as Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana produce much of the world's cacao. This has created jobs for millions of people, but it has also brought new challenges. Farmers often depend on weather conditions they cannot control, and changes in rainfall or temperature can greatly affect the size of each year's harvest. As a result, the price of chocolate sometimes rises because there is less cacao available.
In recent years, consumers have become more interested in where their food comes from. Many people now look for products carrying labels such as Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance. These labels suggest that the cacao has been produced in ways that support farmers, protect the environment, or both. Although not every shopper pays attention to these labels, surveys show that they have become increasingly important, especially among younger consumers. Another interesting development is the growing popularity of dark chocolate. For many years, milk chocolate was by far the most popular choice in many countries because of its sweet, creamy taste. However, researchers have found that dark chocolate contains higher levels of cocoa and may offer certain health benefits when eaten in moderation. This has encouraged some consumers to choose darker varieties, although experts continue to remind people that chocolate should still be enjoyed as part of a balanced diet rather than treated as a health food.
Looking back over its long history, it is remarkable how much chocolate has changed. It began as a bitter ceremonial drink prepared by ancient civilizations. Later became a luxury enjoyed mainly by wealthy Europeans, and eventually developed into an everyday product found in shops around the world. Yet despite all these changes, one thing has remained constant. Chocolate continues to bring people together, whether it is shared during celebrations, given as a gift, or simply enjoyed as a small treat after a busy day. Perhaps that explains why it has remained popular for so many centuries.